So now we're going to get into more of the meat of the how, which is creating a supportive eating environment using the 5 keys. So what are these 5 keys that I keep randomly mentioning? I'm going to talk about them, and they're based upon Ellen Satter's division of responsibility, which she started more than 25 years ago through her research and observations working with parents of young children. It's a trust model of parenting and caregiving that defines different roles and responsibilities for caregivers and children during meals and snack times. A lot of the times, parents, educators, doctors, other healthcare professionals will focus on trying to fix the child. They'll identify something that the child is doing, quote unquote, wrong with eating, such as not eating enough fruits or vegetables or eating too much or too little. But what they're really saying is that the child is flawed. We need to try and fix the child, and the ensuing response to that is very child-focused. But instead, what is usually the problem is the feeding relationship between the caregiver and the child. Ultimately, there's a lot of things we just cannot control about children, but we can control what we do in terms of feeding and improve how we feed, and trust that the child will do their jobs in return. This is a strategy that's supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. The ultimate goal of this is to create competent eaters, which I'm going to discuss next. So a competent eater is one who feels good about eating. They can learn to like unfamiliar foods. It might not be all unfamiliar foods, but there might be foods that are unfamiliar, and they can learn to like some of them. The child will use hunger and fullness cues to know how much to eat, and they are able to enjoy family meals or other meals with other people. These are very broad goals that are qualities that will grow with children so that they will become competent eaters as adults. Children may become competent eaters very quickly. Some children are just really love food. They love it all. They eat it all, which is great, but that's probably not why you all are here today, because you're interested in picky eating. But others may take quite some time, including maybe even through their teenage years. I know a lot of, like my sibling was a very picky eater as a young child, and now as an adult in his 30s, he is not really a picky eater. He still has things he likes and doesn't like, but he eventually did learn to like a lot of variety of foods and eats a very varied diet when he was quite picky as a child. So it could be this lifelong process of learning to eat a variety of foods, and that's okay too. It's important for us to understand that it's going to take children time to learn to become competent. It's not going to happen overnight. So what are these 5 keys? These 5 keys are divided into 2 different responsibility categories. So essentially, parents are responsible for certain things. Parents and caregivers are responsible for certain things as it relates to meal times, which is the food that goes on the table. So what food is served, when the food is served, so when meal times and snacks are, and where that food is served, so where the children are able to eat. And children have responsibilities as well, which is their own autonomy as it relates to how much they want to eat and whether or not they want to eat. And I'll go into more detail on these 5 keys in the ensuing slides. But the different keys represent an authoritative feeding style in which caregivers provide a lot of structure and allow children autonomy that relates to their ever-changing developmental needs. So the first key is what food is served, and this requires that caregivers take responsibility for what food is purchased and goes on the table. Children need to be part of the family at mealtime and served the same foods as the rest of the family, or in the case of school, serve the same foods as the rest of the school. The child doesn't have to eat all the food that the caregiver offers, and they should be allowed to pick and choose from what is served. This helps support their autonomy in making certain choices, which will really help them later in life when they're on their own and they're trying to make certain choices. Caregivers need to trust the child to learn to eat the family foods, and it will take a lot of opportunities to learn a new eating skill and to accept different rules around eating. Ultimately, this key is about caregivers not giving in to their child when they're begging for particular foods in the grocery store or at home. The caregiver may need to learn how to manage tantrums or other types of behaviors that are disruptive at meal times Because ultimately, when we're giving in to children or kind of catering to the pickiness, it doesn't support their ability to learn other foods, because if they're not presented the opportunity to experience other foods and experiment with them, they're not going to have the ability to learn to eat those. So while caregivers should not cater to children, they do need to be considerate. So they should include something during a mealtime that they generally know that the child will eat. A lot of the time, these are things like bread or tortillas or rice. A lot of grain-based foods, children will gravitate towards those. So having those kinds of different side dishes or other dishes that they generally know that the child will eat will help guarantee that they're probably going to eat something at the table, but they might not eat the other foods, and that's okay. With the second key, caregivers take leadership over when eating is allowed. So this is true for both meals and snacks. Snacks need to be scheduled so that children will feel hungry at meal times, because just having children graze throughout the day can keep them from feeling hungry at meals, which will hinder their ability to learn to eat new foods, definitely related to pickiness. There should be no food or caloric drinks consumed in between these times. Of course, water is an always drink that should always be offered, especially when specifically requested. And caregivers need to take the lead in scheduling. So instead of asking children, are you hungry? Do you want to eat breakfast? Instead, just choose a time to serve breakfast and serve it around the same time, more or less every day. And just say, breakfast is ready, it's time to eat. And then the children can come to the table and decide, am I hungry right now? What looks appealing here? What do I want to eat, and eat or not? By placing a priority on eating routines, children are more likely to arrive at mealtimes hungry, but not so hungry that they're upset. And this is important because foods served at mealtimes are usually healthier than those served at other times. Some children may, especially those that are going through separation, individuation, or in the toddler stage, may challenge this rule of when eating is allowed. But by being consistent, caregivers teach their child that they need to follow the rules related to meal and snack times. One thing that comes up a lot is children getting up and down from the table during meals. So, especially young children may have some challenges in terms of focusing on the task of eating, and that's okay. But to encourage children to really sit and focus on the task at hand, it can be helpful to really set that boundary with the child that when you get up from the table, that's when the mealtime is over. So, sit and eat for as long as you want, as much as you want to eat, but the moment you get up, that's when mealtime is done, and we can't come back to the table and eat. And really being consistent with that. And so when the child gets up, they might try to test that rule, being consistent that, okay, well, if you get up, the mealtime's going to be over, and we're gonna put the plate at the sink. They will learn that, I need to sit and eat and focus on the task of eating, and that will help with some of the getting up and down, running around and coming back. So with the third key, this is where food is served, and this is where caregivers determine where eating is allowed. So caregivers should try to join with the family at mealtime, because this helps model good behaviors and helps the children learn to be part of the family. Turning off the TV and other screens during meals and snacks is very important, because it makes room for people to talk and pay attention to each other. Mealtimes are a very excellent way for everyone to connect with each other and foster and maintain healthy social relationships. This may be especially true for children with special needs that might affect some of their social relationships. So mealtimes become really important for them. Caregivers also need to decide where food will be served in their household, and they should try to pick a location or two and stick with it. The caregiver's responsibilities of what, when, and where provide a lot of structure and routine, which creates a very positive learning environment for children. Following the 5 keys, as soon as you can, makes it a lot easier to feed children as they progress into different stages of development, especially those that might foster more picky eating behaviors. All right, and we have just this last slide, and then we'll take a little break to answer some more questions. So the last 2 keys, keys 4 and 5, are the child responsibilities of how much and whether to eat from what is served. And I will say that these are the most challenging keys for anyone to accept. I think a lot of us have maybe grown up with a certain way of feeding where there were 2-bite rules, or they weren't allowed to eat the table till they cleaned their plate. And I think a lot of us, are like, well, I'm okay. Like, what was so bad about that? And I think, it's not that these are going to ruin somebody's life, but if we're really concerned about, fostering the ability to eat competently when someone is eventually on their own, this is really the way we're going to have to try and go about and do it. So talking a little bit more about these keys, there's a lot of research that support these keys that support a child's control of their own eating within a structured eating environment. Caregivers often find these a little bit easier to accept when they understand that it's really normal for children to eat different amounts meal to meal and day to day. So going back to the little picky eating section where there was that graph, it can really vary a lot in terms of, what children are eating, how much they're eating, etc. But these keys describing child responsibilities, again, are very hard for people to accept because people will see a free-for-all and kind of think, oh, the child can eat whatever they want, whenever they want. But the reality is that there's those three caregiver keys, right? The caregiver decides what and when and where, and the child has to follow those rules and be okay with those. And these will help them tune into their internal cues and regulate their eating. So with these keys, children need to be able to decide how much to eat without force or encouragement. The thing about being even positively pressuring or negatively pressuring, usually what happens is we get the opposite desired effect that we were hoping to get. So pressure to eat a certain food will usually result in not wanting to eat any of that food or eating very little of that food and foster negative associations with that food. And even encouragement of eating can do that as well. And restricting foods, if you feel like a child is eating too much, will actually cause the child to worry about getting enough. So if they're still hungry, they're still eating, they're asking for more food, but then that ability to eat that food is taken away from them and they're still hungry, they're going to have this like evolutionary drive to get that food when they can. So it may actually exacerbate eating later on, and they might tend to overeat much more than they normally would at future meals when they're given the opportunity. Children need to be allowed to eat as much or as little as they want and choose which foods to eat from what is offered. Again, that helps them really foster those eating skills that they will need later in life when parents are less involved. And caregivers should continue to limit milk and other caloric drinks like juice or soda to meals and snacks, and limit dessert to a single serving. So this is the only time when we recommend a specific limit on a food, just because desserts are shown to compete quite heavily with other mealtime foods. But I think in order to help create this sense of not depriving the child of that dessert if they do indeed want more after that serving, is to talk about, oh, we had our dessert today. It was so yummy. I also enjoyed it too. I can see that you enjoyed it so much, but don't worry, we're going to have dessert at future meals. You're going to get the opportunity to eat that again. So don't worry about that. And hopefully that will help calm the child's worry that, oh, I'm never going to see this food again. And the potential resulting effect of them trying to eat as much of it as they can when they get the opportunity. All right, so now we've got some time for questions, and then we'll talk about putting these things a little bit into practice.
Okay, Ellie, I have a couple of questions here. Are we considering fruit as a dessert as well? Our dessert component is often fruit if we have a habit.
I would not consider fruit like a true dessert. So in terms of limiting, I wouldn't limit fruit. So if you're serving fruit as a dessert, that, in my opinion, can be completely unlimited. The child can eat as much or as little as they want of that. But if that's what you serve as dessert and you can convey it as dessert, that's totally fine. But just in terms of the limit piece of it, don't worry about that. I'm talking more about like cakes and cookies and things we would traditionally think of as desserts.
Okay, here's another one about desserts. So how can families incorporate desserts without the pressures mentioned? I guess previously where, you take 3 bites of broccoli and then you can have your dessert, but that situation.
That's a good question. So the thing that is actually recommended by Ellen Satter herself is to serve dessert alongside all of the other foods. So if you put just, you know, you get that serving of dessert, you put it out with the other foods, the child might decide to eat that dessert first, and that's okay. They were probably going to eat the dessert anyway afterwards, even if they were full. So they might decide to eat that dessert first. They might not. They might go for the other foods first and take a bite of dessert here and there, and then take a bite of other foods. But putting it alongside the other foods really shows that this food is not any better or worse than these other foods. It's just here, it's food, and we're eating it, and there's other foods available on the table as well. So that can be one way to do it. However, if you would prefer to serve dessert after the meal, that's how you traditionally do it, that's also fine. I would say, you know, when your child says that they're done or they seem done eating, they're kind of picking around at their food and maybe they ate one bite of the green beans or something, just leave that. Don't say, oh, well, dessert's coming and I really want you to eat more of your green beans. Instead, just kind of stop, think about the desire to kind of write that in your mind and think, okay, it's okay. My child didn't eat as much green beans as I was hoping today, but that's okay. There's another day, more opportunities to learn to eat that food, and go ahead and serve dessert when it seems like the main portion of the meal is done for the child.
Okay, great. Annette, I have also one question. How about having food presented on the plate in front of the child versus family style where you pass dishes around and then the child chooses the foods?
You can choose how you want to do that. What is generally recommended is to serve foods family style, because it will really, really foster that autonomy. And I think this is actually a strategy if you have a child that is afraid of certain foods, which I know can definitely happen with certain special needs. There might be like actually food fears. One way to really help with that is to serve foods family style, because that really shows the child that you get to choose. You do not have to take that food. I'm not going to put it on your plate. You can take other foods that you want, and that food is separate. Other people will have it, but you don't have to have it. That being said, if you're someone who prefers to serve foods on the plate, that's just easier for you. I'm not going to say that that's wrong. I would say just pay attention to how your child is kind of feeling about the food when it's presented in front of them, because if there's like really a true disgust of a certain food, that could affect the ability to eat other foods. So just tune into that. If the child says like, oh my God, I really don't want these green beans on my plate, like, can they please be removed? Try to respect that as much as you feel willing. Or you can just say, you know what, you don't have to eat those. Like, they're on your plate, but you can completely ignore them. Don't worry about it. Just giving as much encouragement and explanation as possible that this being on the plate is not a pressure for you to eat it. It's just, if you want it, it's there. So those are some ways to go about feeding, and I think they're all perfectly fine.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's all the questions for now.
Okay. All right, so we'll move on. We'll kind of, normally during my trainings like this, we would be doing some very interactive activities. So the next thing is not so much super interactive, but it's just a little break. We'll get to watch a couple videos, and you all can put some responses to a couple questions in the chat box. So we'll go to 5 keys in practice. The little activity that we're going to do is watch a very short 2-minute video about a young boy named Sean. He's probably like 3, maybe 2. I don't know. It's sometimes when I look at children, I'm like, I have no idea how old the child is, but he looks like he's maybe about 3. So during this video, what I'm hoping you will pay attention to is, what do you think Sean, the child on the right, is thinking and feeling during this mealtime? And try to, if possible, pinpoint some keys that might be missing from this meal. So if there may be some parent responsibilities that were kind of given over to the child, or if the parent sort of took over some of the child responsibilities, try to see if you can identify some of those during this. And yeah, so we'll go ahead and get started on watching the video.
This is what you get. Woo! Some green beans.
See it?
I know.
Donut tray?
I know you didn't want green going to get you noodles, you see, but you also need to eat the green beans, please.
I want it.
These are noodles. Do you see? These are noodles. I'm giving you noodles and green beans. That's a good one. Ooh, that's a nice big one. Mmm, yummy. Hey, look at that. You asked me for buttered noodles, but you're not even eating them, dude. Are they yucky today?
Oh, did you see your brother having watermelon? You want a piece of watermelon
Of
too?
course he does. Okay, 2 more bites of watermelon, and then 1 green bean.
And then 4 more bites of watermelon.
Okay, good. So 2 bites of watermelon, 1 green beans, and then 4 more bites of watermelon. Good time. I like green beans. I don't know why they don't like green beans. And then put it on your mouth really fast, and then drink some milk. Okay, put it in your mouth really fast, and then no, and then swallow some milk, quick. No, that trick's not working. That trick's not working today. Yeah. Green beans?
No, I'm done.
No.
Yummy.
Are you really full already?
Yeah.
Really?
No.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you are. Can you wait for the rest of us to eat? Can you just sit at the table with us?
I'm full.
Okay, you can be full. You don't have to keep eating, but I'd like you to stay at the table.
I'm full.
I heard you. I heard you say that you're full.
I'm full without you.
Yeah, but I'm...
All right, so that's the end of the video. So I'll give you a few seconds to put in the chat box. What do you think Sean is thinking and feeling during this meal? What's going on? A lot of pressure and frustration not being heard. Yes, I completely agree with you. Anything else? He's frustrated. Yes, definitely. You can see it, you can hear it. He made a clear choice. Very true. Yes. He even stated at the end, he was like, I'm done. His mom said, I don't know if you're done. All right. For the second question, which keys do you think are missing? There's definitely some that are like, we could definitely try to work on some of these. We've got what and when as a response. Possibly the when. I would definitely say the what for sure. She seems to have made noodles directly for Sean. When, I'm not totally sure actually, because I think it seems like they've chosen a time to eat and are sitting down. Food's not exciting enough. That's definitely possible. How much definitely was taken over. She kind of took over the how much. We have mommy should not have allowed Sean to eat watermelon before the green beans. Well, I think that kind of goes to some of the things we talked about today, which is, you know, who's to say whether we should eat green beans or watermelon first? I don't even think the watermelon is there as a dessert. I think it's just there as a food. So I think, you know, in terms of just following the 5 keys, if we allow Sean to eat the watermelon or the green beans in whatever order he wants, that's going to be as supportive as possible for him and really take off a lot of that pressure. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide, which has just what I think are some of my thoughts on that. So I think in terms of, from my perspective, what Sean is thinking and feeling is he's annoyed and he's distressed and he's pretty upset. And I think he's thinking, please let me do it myself. You could see this struggle that he's like really wants a lot of autonomy as it relates to this mealtime, and it's being taken away from him. And I think in terms of some of the keys that are missing, it seems like the what might be missing. It kind of looks like the buttered noodles were specifically made for him and not served to the rest of the family. I think it would have been totally fine if she had, had those buttered noodles and everyone had the opportunity to eat them, and Sean could have eaten them as well. And she definitely kind of took away both of the child responsibilities. I think, at the end, he was saying, I'm full, but she's like, I don't know if you're full. I kind of think you might not be. She was also putting a lot of pressure to eat the green beans, especially. And even with the noodles, apparently he didn't eat much of the noodles, even though he had specifically wanted them. And she was kind of pressuring around that too. So one thing I do want to say here, this is being very critical of this meal and his mom in a lot of ways, but I want to say, it's really important to acknowledge the things that are already in place, because feeding a family is hard. It is very, very hard. And so when things are in place that we would maybe view as the ideal scenario, we should definitely recognize that and give some upfront recognition. I would definitely say to this mom, you've got the when and the where down. It seems like you've chosen a time that we're going to sit and eat, and we're eating at the table. We're all eating together as a family. There's no TV going on. There's no cell phones going on or anything like that. And that's really important. And that in and of itself can be so hard to do. And then through other techniques, we could potentially talk about, some of the other things that are going on that might be contributing to some of the picky eating. So I'm actually going to show this video again, but there's going to be a narration by Ellen Satter. I think it can just be kind of fun to hear her take on things as the person who really created these 5 keys. So I'll get that started.
This is what you get. Some green beans.
Jenny thinks 3-and-a-half-year-old Sean is too picky, and she works way too hard to feed him. Right from the start, she pressures him to eat the dreaded green beans. She also makes noodles, especially for him.
These are noodles. Do you see? These are noodles. I'm giving you noodles and green beans.
Sean likes watermelon, but Jenny can't relax and let him enjoy it. She worries about the noodles.
Hey, look at that. You asked me for buttered noodles, but you're not even eating them, dude.
While she was cooking, Jenny asked Sean if he wanted noodles. Children don't know what they'll eat until the food is in front of them, and generally not even then.
Okay, 2 more bites of watermelon, and then 1 green bean.
And then 4 more bites of watermelon.
Okay, good. So 2.
Bargaining with Sean about eating is unpleasant for both of them and doesn't work. Who knows how many bites of green beans it takes to earn a few bites of watermelon.
And then put it on your mouth really fast, and then drink some milk.
Sean tries to please Jenny, but those green beans are just too much. Jenny doesn't have to get Sean to eat, nor does she have to short order cook for him. Instead, she can let him choose what and how much to eat from what is on the table. At first, he'll avoid green beans and other foods he's been pressured to eat, but he'll start eating them again once he trusts that his eating is his business.
Are you really full already?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you are.
Sean might not be full, just eager to get away. Jenny wants the best for Sean, but struggling with him about his eating makes him eat worse, not better. Her interference contributes to his picky eating, and it can even make him eat less than he needs.
All right, so that's just kind of Ellen Satter's take on the scenario. So she talked about a lot of things like the catering. She didn't necessarily need to make noodles especially for him, although she certainly could have made them for the whole family. That would have been one of those considerate foods perhaps for him, because she knows that he likes them, but he doesn't really like the green beans. And one thing that I want to point out that Ellen Satter mentioned is that these things can often make children eat less than they actually need. And once she does take the pressure off, he will probably still continue to avoid those foods. So immediately removing pressure to eat and creating a supportive environment is not necessarily going to generate immediate results. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is the longer a practice has been used to eat, like pressuring, the longer it's going to take for the child to trust that they're not going to be pressured to eat that food and maybe be more receptive to that food. So I'll talk a little bit more about setting expectations in a couple of slides, but that's a really important thing here to note, that this is not like an immediate solution that's going to create overnight results. It could take a really long time, and actually some behaviors might get worse before they get better, but they will eventually get better, and parents can certainly trust that. So one thing I want to talk about is motivational interviewing. This is maybe more specific to some of the practitioners on the training today that do more one-on-one stuff with children and parents. But this certainly could be used in any conversation with a parent that you're having. So maybe if you're a teacher and you're like during parent-teacher conferences, for some reason eating comes up, you can certainly use motivational interviewing in that scenario. And essentially, motivational interviewing is a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication with particular attention to the language of change. It's designed to strengthen personal motivation for a commitment to a specific goal by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. And I think the compassion piece here is so important for parents, again, especially parents of children with special needs. There's a lot going on, so much to do and keep track of and assist with and all of these things. And it can be really overwhelming. And I think sometimes the food piece might be the last thing on their minds. So accepting that and having compassion for that will be key when talking to them about food-related issues. So motivational interviewing techniques, I'm just going to kind of go over the main techniques and how they might specifically relate to talking about the 5 keys. They can be very helpful when trying to solve the issue of a child's picky eating. It can really help us tame our desire to overload the parent on all of the aspects of the 5 keys and focus on the thing that they want to work on most. I will say presenting all of these 5 keys to parents that might not be doing a lot of them can be really, really, really overwhelming. So kind of approaching it one thing at a time, maybe not even talking about 5 keys or division of responsibility as a concept, but just talking about very specific solutions that might fit within those 5 keys could be an easier way to understand and accept and approach that. Using this technique will also help us better understand what might be missing from the 5 keys and why, and gauge the caregiver's readiness to implement certain keys. So there are essentially 4 parts of the motivational interviewing process. During the engaging portion, practitioners should ask rapport-building questions to understand the background of the caregiver. They need to listen to what caregivers have to say and reflect back to the caregiver what they've learned. They should try to affirm when they hear about practices we would like them to do and fully support the caregiver's decision whether or not they want to hear certain information and work on certain things. Some examples of phrases that might be used during this stage might include, tell me a little bit more about how you feed your family, really getting at what's going on at the table, how do the kids eat, what gets fed to them. It sounds like you've got a good routine down for meals and snacks, but that you're worried about your son's picky eating. Maybe the parent has come to you, they've described this awesome meal and snack routine, but their child is still picky. So you're just reflecting that information back to them, confirming to them that you understand the problem. And if you didn't fully understand the problem, believe me when I say that they will tell you. Tell me more about what happens during meal times. Again, just eliciting more information. And asking permission. So can I share my thoughts on some of the issues that you brought up? Asking that permission can be really important because a lot of the time we hear about a practice and our immediate thought is to have this like writing reflex where we want to immediately give information like, oh, I've got the perfect solution to that problem. I'm just going to throw it out there right now. But if the parent isn't super receptive to that, maybe they're not ready to hear that information yet, or they just need to be put in that mindset of, oh, I'm going to be given some information right now, asking their permission to share your thoughts can really help put them more in that mindset and be more accepting of the information that's going to be given to them. And if they say no, respecting that is really important. And you could always try to give that information at another time when they're more ready. Focusing is the next element of motivational interviewing. This is the part where a practitioner and caregiver work together to decide what the caregiver does or does not want to work on. Examples of phrases that might come up during this stage include, what's something you want to work on related to feeding your family? So you can really talk about some of the issues that they are really feel are pressing and that they want to address right now. And that will help with developing some of that motivation to address it. And I have some ideas on some potential starting points. Can I share them with you? Maybe they're not sure where to start. And the reason why they're there is because they want your expertise. So asking that permission again, and then sharing those thoughts after once you get it. Evoking is the third element of motivational interviewing. This is where the practitioner works to build motivation for change, asking caregivers their ideas about what motivates them to do certain things. And if there's some ambivalence towards change that comes up, oh, maybe this just seems too hard right now, too overwhelming, you can discuss that with them in a non-judgmental way. Really normalize that. You know, change is hard for everyone, and especially changes around feeding and feeding families and children with special needs is going to be hard. And you could potentially work together to try and resolve it or not and build that motivation. Some phrases that might come up during this element would include, what motivates you to get food on the table? So if there's maybe an issue around the timing of food or something like that. Or on a scale from 1 to 10, how ready or confident do you feel to address your son's picky eating? So this is a great way to really put a number to the level of motivation. And when they give that answer, let's say the parent said, oh, I don't know, a 5. You can ask, what makes you say a 5 instead of say an 8? And they'll explain the difference between, well, I feel like it's a 5 because, you know, and then an 8 really feels like, okay, I can go out and do this, but I don't feel like I can do that right now. And maybe the issue is that they don't have the information or the tools that they need to address it. And you can work on that one-on-one. And another one might be, what do you like or not like about the way your family eats? That will potentially open up some opportunities to work on some certain things, like something that they want to work on. The final element of motivational interviewing is planning, where the practitioner supports the caregiver in creating a plan based on their insights and expertise. It's important that the caregiver is ready for this. Don't push it if they're not ready, and continue to work on engaging, focusing, and evoking. Phrases that might come up during this stage include, tell me what you've done to try and address your child's picky eating. It's really important to understand some of the strategies that have already been used, because they might have tried some of the things that you are going to suggest, and in their minds, maybe it didn't work. You know, they tried it one night and it just didn't work, and they're like, okay, well, I don't know if this is the right strategy for me. And you can talk about that and talk through it. And maybe the issue there is that there's, you know, an expectation that it's going to change really quickly, or maybe they really did try it for a long time and it just didn't work, and you can try some other strategy. Can I tell you some strategies that I have seen work for other families with picky eaters? And really do draw upon your expertise. What have you seen with other families with picky eaters, and what has worked for them? And what do you think is the next step to get started on this goal? So really actively getting to that planning step of, okay, we're going to take action and we're going to do this thing. So laying out expectations during this process is going to be important. So when you do end up deciding on a strategy and planning that out, it's really going to be important to establish what improvement means in terms of child behavior. So I think I mentioned before that, you know, sometimes things will get worse before they get better. Let's say a child has been restricted a lot at the table, and they're suddenly not restricted anymore. They may eat a lot for a long period of time, seemingly at every meal, and it may go on longer than the parent or caregiver is willing to accept. But it will eventually calm down. This is just a response to not being able to trust that the child's going to get enough. Or let's say they've been really, really heavily pressured to eat certain foods. So like the dreaded green beans with Sean seems to have been pressured a lot to eat those. And once the pressure's taken off, he may just completely avoid green beans and not look at them, not think about them for quite a while. And maybe eventually, if the pressure has not come back, he'll try one, you know. But it might take a really long time for that to happen, depending on how long the practice has been used. And that goes into reasonable timeframes to see improvement. And like I said before, generally speaking, the longer a practice has been used, the longer it's going to take for resolution or improvement to be seen. And that, again, things may get worse before they get better. One other thing I want to mention in relation to what improvement specifically might look like, usually the last thing that happens is the like full desired behavior. So let's say the desired behavior is, I want my child to eat more fruits and vegetables. That's going to be the last thing that the parent is going to see, but there might be some other things that happen before that that are showing that this is working. The first thing might just be that the child feels more comfortable coming to the table. If there's been a lot of pressure or restriction or a lot of strife around meal times, just coming to the table and sitting and enjoying the family time and maybe eating a few bites is a sign of progress. Another thing that might happen is there might be a lot of playing around with certain foods. Generally speaking, children kind of go about learning to eat new foods in a sort of stepwise fashion. And they will often just kind of they'll look at the food, they'll notice it, they might notice that the parent is eating it, and that's kind of the first step. The second one is that they might actually kind of play around with it on the plate, they're kind of experimenting with it, they might even put it in their mouth and spit it back out. You know, I know that's kind of not behavior that most of us would like to see, and especially not in public, but parents can just teach their child, you know, if we're going to be in public and you're going to spit out your food, that's okay. Just, you know, politely take a napkin and spit it out in there. So we can teach behaviors to make it a bit more polite if that's something that parents are worried about. And then finally, the child might put the food in their mouth and take one bite, and they might chew it and even swallow that. But they might not eat any more. But that is progress, you know, just not putting any pressure on during any of those stages, letting the child really experiment with that food and get comfortable with it on their own is going to hopefully eventually lead to them eating that food. But they might take that bite and decide, it's not for me right now, and they'll try it again another time. So this is our last section. If we want to stop for questions, maybe a couple questions came up. I have maybe about 10 to 15 more minutes of content. So do you have any questions that came up?
I don't see any questions at this time. I had a little blip in my Wi-Fi, so hopefully that hasn't affected everybody else. Is everybody else seeing everything okay?
It looks good over here.
Okay.
Judy,
Okay.
always good. Thank you. Lots
Okay.
of thanks to Ali. And I don't see questions on the chat either.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll do the next part and then we'll get to any questions you might have at the end.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk more specifically about some considerations based upon certain types of special needs. So I actually really needed some help in creating this section. I used a lot of wonderful online resources from a lot of different special needs organizations, and I was just trying to think about how can I even organize this in a way that isn't going to be like a whole other separate 2-hour training where we could talk about each like many individual special needs and different nutrition considerations. And it seemed like the best way to do it was to really divide different special needs that might come up in these different domains of physical special needs, developmental, emotional and behavioral, and sensory. And separating them into these categories, I want to recognize that many children with special needs might have needs across all of these categories, and they are definitely going to be interplaying with one another. So I just want to highlight right off the bat, you're going to see a lot of recommendations from me to consult specific professionals, which is maybe a little frustrating because it's like, no, is that like, I need a tool right now. I need to know what I can go do right now in my home or what my clients can go do right now. But unfortunately, I don't have quite the expertise on a lot of very specific special needs, but there are a lot of wonderful practitioners out there that do. And so consulting them is going to be of utmost importance in those scenarios. So first I'll start out with nutrition and physical needs. So Some really big ones here that I remembered from, even just working with some people and from schooling and all of that kind of stuff and reading a number of things is the ability to pick up, chew, and swallow foods might be an issue for a lot of children. Maybe they're having issues with muscle tone, developing muscle, and that can affect their ability to control those even finer, even gross motor skills. So some potential considerations here are getting support from a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, and or a speech language pathologist, maybe all three might be needed, to assess a child's ability to build their motor skills and find some feeding and eating tools might be really important here. This is one where there might be a disconnect between what the child is physically able to do and what they are mentally ready for. There's definitely, I was reading a wonderful story about a mother who had a child with Down syndrome, and she was introducing solids to her child with Down syndrome, and the child was so ready to eat. She's like, the child is reaching for the food. She's looking at us a lot when we're eating. It's very clear to that mom that the child was ready to eat. And she's even able to chew and swallow foods for sure. But there were some issues with the fine motor control around her ability to really pick up those foods. But what she noticed is, maybe just by making a few alterations with the food, the child was able to work around those limitations, and working with a physical therapist and occupational therapist, the child was able to feed themselves and just really beautifully and wonderfully. And they were mentally ready for that, and they were able to, overcome the physical limitation of not being able to use like the pincer grasp and things like that. And there are like actual physical tools too that we might be able to get for the child that will help them in that journey to learn to eat. Referring to an RD to assess nutrition needs and consider nutrition support if the child can't consume enough to meet needs. So something that might come up here, which is related to the one below about energy to eat or fatigue, not having like full physical abilities can make the process of eating a lot more difficult and a lot more tiring for children. So that's okay. There's not like a ton we can do about that necessarily, aside from maybe the physical and occupational therapy. But what we can do to be supportive is if they truly are not getting enough because they're just getting straight up tired at the end of the meal, and they're not meeting their nutrition needs, or in failure to thrive or something like that, we can definitely consider nutrition support for that child. Maybe they just need a little bit extra food going into their bellies via enteral nutrition during a mealtime that's supplementing what they're already eating. So it's not to say that we're completely taking over eating for that child. They're still able to eat to the extent that they feel physically able. And then afterwards, if they're still, feeling hungry, we can kind of supplement that with some enteral nutrition. And then impaired digestion can definitely be an issue for a lot of children with special needs. And here it's so important to consult with a GI doctor or a nutritionist, or both. I would highly recommend both. There's a lot of really great nutritionists out there that specialize in GI disorders and GI issues. So making sure that we're supporting that GI function and all of that, and their ability to absorb nutrients from their GI tract will definitely require the help of a specialist and working through maybe some food sensitivities or other things like that. Going more now into some specific developmental needs, I was thinking more in terms of cognitive development here. One issue that might come up is developmental delays. And these often go together with physical needs, like delayed development of motor skills. So that's definitely something to consider. And that's partly why earlier in the presentation, I really talked about milestones. So progressing based on what children can do, both mentally and physically, even if they're developing a bit more slowly, might be important. There's actually a webinar that will be at the end of this presentation, but it will also be, a link to it will be sent in the resources about feeding children with special needs that's free from the Ellen Satter Institute. And they talk specifically about Down syndrome in one of them, and how the child was developing, and that they were still, entirely being bottle fed by year 1, but that was just because these other developmental milestones hadn't quite come along yet, but the child was eventually eating solid foods. So it just might take a little bit longer, and going based on what the child can do is going to be important. Learning and reasoning ability. So discussion of some complex food and nutrition topics should really be based on learning and reasoning ability. And this is really true for all children. There's a lot of nutrition education that happens that is really beyond the specific developmental abilities of even children without special needs that we kind of need to consider. Ellen Satter, for those of you that are teachers out there, actually has, I believe, a handout that specifically addresses this and talks about what are the different concepts at different ages and developmental stages where children are ready to hear certain nutrition topics. And I actually did not include that in my email to Judy to send out. So I'll actually, Judy, if that's okay, I'll send a follow-up email with that resource if I can find it. But also just perusing the Ellen Satter Institute, you'll probably be able to find that as well. One thing here also that's really important is nurturing that internal food regulation. So even children with special needs are going to have those internal drives, like the vast majority of the time, to eat based upon their needs, both their energy and their nutrient needs, and will be kind of driven to eat certain foods or certain amounts to get all the foods that they need. So really nurturing that internal food regulation by having meal and snack routines and following the 5 keys will be really important to fostering their ability to learn to eat foods in a competent way that maybe transcends ability to learn more complex nutritional concepts. And then finally, ability to communicate about food could definitely be an issue. So maybe some support from a speech language pathologist here on strengthening certain communication abilities. And then looking for nonverbal cues related to what's going on with the child's food and eating is going to be of utmost importance here as well. There might be a lot of nonverbal cues that we have to tune into about, what is too much, what is not enough, that kind of thing. So just to give examples that are typically there might be body language, like even just turning away, like let's say you're introducing solid foods, the child just turning their head away. They don't, that's kind of saying, I don't want to eat that. I don't want that to go in my mouth. So really paying attention to those cues, even beyond, just the child and toddler and other stages might be important for children who struggle with verbal communication. In terms of behavioral and emotional needs, this is a really big one. Anxiety and fear about food is huge, and that can definitely be brought on by a number of things. It could be brought on by pressure, but it also could just occur. We don't know how children are going to react to certain foods, and they may have certain special needs that make them more fearful of foods. So we're working with a therapist here to increase and encourage coping skills for anxiety and finding different therapeutic approaches to reduce fear without force or pressure. This one's really important to me because there are some methods out there that involve, like slowly exposing the child and even like forcing the child to like just eventually lick the food or something like that. And I think a lot of the time we might not get our desired results in that sense, especially if the child is truly fearful. And if they're being forced to do that, it may just actually increase the fear. So I think there are definitely approaches out there, but I'm not super knowledgeable about them in terms of encouraging coping skills around anxiety about food that don't result in forcing or pressuring children related to that food. Eliminating pressure to eat or not eat from the eating environment can be very beneficial here. A really awesome example that I got in another webinar that was specifically about children for autism was the child was very fearful of oatmeal that was being served at breakfast. Like they couldn't be in the same room as it. They would have a total and complete meltdown about the oatmeal. And what they ultimately instituted was that the parent would be incredibly clear every single time with the child, you do not have to eat the oatmeal. And they even wrote it on the board. They wrote it on a little whiteboard that they had visible during meal times that said, you do not have to eat the oatmeal. And eventually that child really internalized that message. Okay, I have the autonomy to eat or not eat the oatmeal. I don't have to be fearful that it's going to be forced on me. And that eventually reduced their anxiety significantly, and they were able to eat a meal that also had oatmeal involved in it. They might not have eaten oatmeal, but they were at least able to be at the table. Serving unfamiliar foods alongside familiar foods, I would say this is really only applicable if the fear or anxiety is just pretty mild. If it's a really, really high fear or anxiety, we might want to be a little bit careful because we don't want to have the other familiar foods potentially be associated with the feared food, and then also have them fear those foods. But this can be a potential thing that can help with making the unfamiliar food more palatable or okay. Ensuring that enough food is present and providing linkages for food security. So this is about anxiety and fear about not having enough, which will often result in eating a lot when we get the chance, maybe more than we need at that given time. So improving food security here is going to be really important. Ability to focus on eating. So discussing potential medication options, if this is maybe related to ADD or ADHD, but it might be just generally their ability to focus on eating aside from those special needs is challenged. And this is true for a lot of children. So I think I mentioned earlier, encouraging some boundary setting and follow through at meal times around when we get up from the table, that signals the end of the meal. That can be a really powerful tool in our pocket to get that message across, and follow through is of utmost importance there. It's really important to talk about medication side effects, so consulting with a doctor or a dietitian about potential nutritional impacts of certain medications. For example, weight gain is a complication or a side effect of a lot of different kinds of medications, and understanding that and talking about that with parents can be really important to sort of soothe that worry that it's, your child's weight gain is not necessarily because they're eating too much food or what have you. It's just a side effect of this medication. It's not necessarily something we have to be overly worried about. And so therefore not potentially restricting the child or something like that. So dealing with medication side effects is going to be important there. And then persistent mealtime opposition and defiance. There's likely the need for cognitive behavioral and family therapy here, and ensuring that parents are really following the 5 keys, especially the child responsibilities, and fostering that autonomy with both of those is probably going to be really important to address some of the defiance that's coming up. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about sensory needs. A big one here is food-related sensory processing. This can often go together with food anxiety and fear. So a lot of children with special needs will experience heightened sensations, either with tastes or smells, or even with the way certain foods look. And they might heighten certain sensory responses. You might be able to work with a nutritionist to reduce the negative food sensations by altering cooking or serving techniques. We actually talk about this a lot in like the cancer world, when certain foods, food sensations are heightened when you're on chemotherapy and other things. There's a lot of things that we can do to make sure that those are kind of reduced. So if it's a smell related thing, you can try to have covers on different food containers as they're being eaten to reduce some of those smells, or you could serve foods cold so they're not emitting nearly as many smells, things like that. And RDs are definitely going to have some ideas on how foods could potentially be altered to reduce certain sensations associated with them. Children may learn to eat new foods more slowly and or have a somewhat limited list of liked foods if they have a lot of sensory related processing. And this is okay, as long as that list is not super duper short. There's some variety there's something from every food group in there. It might just be a little bit more limited for these children. And then finally, ability to see food. So a lot of children are very visual eaters, but a lot of children also have visual impairment. They may not be able to see the food as well or at all. So working with a vision specialist and an RD on some potential assistive technologies to encourage independence with eating will be important here. So some things might include high contrast utensils and materials for serving food, encouraging a lot of hands-on learning experiences with food. So touching food, if they're willing, putting it in the mouth and just kind of seeing what that texture is like. They don't have to necessarily swallow it. So encouraging those different types of experiences so the children can become familiar with the food without necessarily having to see it can be really important. All right, the last thing that I'm going to talk about, just briefly going to go through some resources, and all of these will be included in the follow-up email. So one big resource we've got offered through the health department is our Helping Parents to Feed Well online training. If you go to sccphd.org/5keys, that's our main page for the Childhood Feeding Collaborative. And right on that page, we've got a few trainings that you can definitely take. And this is 4 30-minute long modules. It talks about a lot of the things that I discussed here today, but it also talks a lot about some of the research behind this that supports these different methods. It's just hard to cover it cover everything in a training, so I didn't go too much into that. But if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the research, definitely check that training out. We also have some handouts that can be particularly helpful. We have a more general handout called the five Keys to Raising a Healthy, Happy Eater. It's just a general overview of the division of responsibility. We have where the different caregiver responsibilities with some specific tips underneath there, and then child responsibilities. And then at the bottom, we have some potential goals that could be set. So maybe if you're working one-on-one or you're not sure where to start, there's a list there that are potential places to start if those things aren't in place. WIC is an amazing resource. They have some pretty awesome handouts, and my favorite one from them is the WIC Tips for Picky Eaters. It is double-sided, and it has like these specific responses like, my child doesn't like to try new foods, or my child doesn't always want to eat what I serve, she wants something else. And then they give some tips related to addressing that specific concern. They have it in both English and Spanish, and that will definitely be sent out as well. And finally, webinars. So there's some specific ones about picky eaters, extreme picky eating. There are 2 parts. That was by Katja Rao. There will be links to those set out. Most of these, like three out of the, 3 out of the 4 that are listed here are paid training. So it will cost money to do these. I will say they are relatively inexpensive. So if you're a professional, maybe you can get that reimbursed as part of your professional work. Or not, or just encourage it or incorporate it into your continuing education. But I found this training to be so helpful, and it really does go into about, the extreme side of picky eating, and ways that can address that. Specifically for children with special needs, there's Raising Special Needs Children to be Competent Eaters, offered by the Ellen Satter Institute. This is free. It's a 3-part series. It has a lot of wonderful information and talks also about the 5 keys. And then Feeding Children with Autism. So if you work with someone, a child with autism, or you have a child with autism, Feeding Children with Autism using the Satter model was an incredibly helpful training for me as well. They do have a lot of very specific tips there. So if you're really looking for a more deep dive on feeding children with autism, I highly recommend that training. And then just more general division of responsibility, you could go to the one that I mentioned earlier that's on the Feeding Collaborative webpage, the Helping Parents to Feed Well training. Or you could go to this training, Foundations for Feeding, Trusting the Trust model, really gets at why we need to use a model of trust with children and feeding them, and some of the sort of evolutionary bases of what this feeding model is all about. And these are just some of the references that I used during the training. So are there any questions? Also feel free to reach out to me via email. My email here is listed. I believe it will also be put in the chat box, and hopefully in the follow-up email as well. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have additional questions that you can't think of.
I have one last question here, Allie, and then we can wrap it up. The question is, where would you put food avoidance disorder in here?
Food avoidance disorder. Let me look. I would say it's behavioral and emotional for sure. And I would probably say it's related to anxiety and fear about food probably, and maybe even persistent mealtime opposition and defiance. But yeah, I probably going to have to work with a team of specialists. Really, with any child with special needs, they're probably going to have a pretty robust team of different people that are going to have to help with these different issues. So I would definitely put it in the behavioral category, and it's probably related to anxiety and fear about food.
Okay, great, thanks. That's all the questions we have for the moment.
Okay. Any other questions out there? Put them in the chat.
Yeah, there is one in the chat, but I'm not sure if you know what that stands for. ARFID?
Oh, ARFID. I have to remind myself of, I know what it is, but I'd have to remind myself of the acronym. So what's the question specifically?
What it means.
What it means, yeah. Okay.
And I couldn't get that one. But
I'm going to end the show. Hold on. And actually, I believe in the extreme picky eating training, she talks about ARFID. Avoidant restricted food intake disorder. Yeah. So if you are interested in learning more about ARFID and potential ways to deal with that, I would definitely check out that extreme picky eating training, because she did talk about it. And she talks about a lot of the conventional methods that are being used to treat like failure to thrive and ARFID. And she talks specifically about why some of those might actually be problematic, and then other solutions that we can use to help treat those issues.
Okay, well, it's time to wrap things up. Thanks everyone for spending this time. Our time's coming to a close. For any further questions, please email info@php.com. And remember to look for my follow-up email, which will have my contact information, a list of resources from today's presentation, and 2 webinar evaluations. So a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. We'll be shared a great deal of information, and thanks, be well, and see you next time.